Anything specific come to mind?
Well, I do think that the strict timelines and, for administering, entering, sending in, got in the way. I think that they should have been built in. Well, I don't know. I mean, I don't know this would be effective across an entire school system. As a principal, I was saying to Adele earlier, I could imagine actually looking through the tool with my teachers, maybe having conversations earlier with people I trusted, primary literacy people, about parts that were essential, parts that maybe weren't essential, maybe developing a sort of school-wide take on how we wanted to use it, which parts we wanted to make sure to get done by a certain time.
Implementation-wise, I don't know. I think if you piloted it in a different way and made it, it's one thing to say it's not mandated, but you put it in the hands of, someone who's got, 35 schools to supervise and, or 30 classes in their own school to supervise, and it's kind of like, what's the shortcut to that? How do I implement it? Would it have been helpful to perhaps pilot it in some schools that were inclined to do it, to kind of take more feedback from them? I'm not sure if that occurred before it was implemented whole scale the way it was. Could you have taken parts of it and implemented it? The parts that seemed most accessible, the parts that seemed most useful, like running records, like.
I was going to say maybe prioritize the different pieces of it, because it was getting the whole kit and caboodle done for every kid.
Yeah.
That
got
kind of got in
managed.
the way.
Yeah. And then I think ultimately, like, down the road, you look at it and you see all of those conversations about, well, this kid isn't really a level F reader, this kid is a level G reader, and there's so many other things that implies, and there's so many parts to that. I don't know that those conversations were occurring before. Like, even the fact that teachers are saying, this level of E-class doesn't really match the Fountas and Pinnell levels exactly, and here's what makes this book really challenging. That was like, it's hard to remember that at that point, back then, that was actually a new conversation. Really looking closely at the supports and challenges of a particular book that made it hard for kids, and taking those E-class books, whether you like the selections or not, and I'm not sure how they were chosen, but whether you like those selections or not, that conversation, like, this book is awful, like, this language is so esoteric, or the vocabulary is so particular that it really doesn't work for kids, and the font is not user-friendly. Those are pretty big conversations for teachers to be having, and even in its demise, it some of the things that grew out of it, and then I think ultimately classroom libraries grew out of it as well, because the conversation was, great, I know what level my kids are at now, or reading on now. What good does that do me? I don't have any books in my classroom, because people were in sort of reading, basal reader kinds of situations, and it wasn't like you could learn a level and say, I got a world of books that are going to be like just right for you right now. And then $30 million later, classroom libraries kind of went out to schools, and I think that was a really good thing.
What are your thoughts about policies currently in place in New York City about primary grade literacy assessment? What strikes you about this climate as compared to that climate?
I feel safe in assuming that Adele and I probably have similar feelings about, maybe I shouldn't assume, about the data culture that we are living in, I don't actually think that E-class, certainly not in its original intent, was supposed to be this, but we're in a place now where there's been a lot of attention paid to the collection of data, and a certain amount to the interpretation, not as much, and very little to instruction. And people live and die by these numbers, and as a result, ironically, or I shouldn't say ironically, sadly.
Sadly.
In many schools across the system, I mean, my position as a network leader, I work with 27 different schools and have contact with others. And many schools are paying less attention to primary instruction as a result of the data culture we're in, because kids aren't formally tested before third grade, which is silly, obviously. But it's all about this year and what your progress report grade is going to be this year and how that's going to reflect on you. And we were talking earlier about, if you make a wholesale change, for example, to the way teachers are trained to be better diagnosticians, are you saying that the kids that are here this year are going to, get short shrift during the transition, right? And, I guess historically, it's disturbed me that urgency has often been an excuse for shoddy change, and that's kind of the way I feel about what's happened to primary instruction, really. And as far as primary assessment, there are some good tools out there. The TC assessments, I think, are pretty good. There's some others. I don't think any of them are perfect. But I worry when people just start implementing them thoughtlessly and without a lot of attention being paid to what you're going to do with the information, or even being critical. I don't know. I did a study with some teachers comparing where the kids came out in their F&P levels with the TC assessments compared to QRIs, and the same kids came out at different levels. So what does that mean? And how are these assessments different, and why is that happening?
Do you think teachers get the message that there's a space to think critically about things that they're mandated to do?
In some schools, but across the system, no.
Okay, so you go back to Project Read, right? The idea was no one would get past third grade. There would be such a laser-like focus on kids in first through third grade learning to read that all these issues with testing would be resolved before it was ever a high-stakes environment. And that just completely flipped to where there were all of a sudden these high-stakes assessments in the upper grades. You can't send a kid to summer school if you want to unless they've failed a standardized assessment in only certain grades. Even as a school, it's very difficult for me. Like, I would like to run a summer program for early childhood kids. I would love to have my kids who could use richer language and richer cultural experiences at MoMA and in Central Park for July. And I think, I pretty much guarantee that they'd perform better down the road, that they would have better experiences to perform better on third grade assessments, but they would be much more engaged in school and their experiences would be richer, and we would all feel good about the kinds of things that they're doing. I think that's...
But that's not something that would be supported.
On the contrary, I feel like when we talk about, well, we got to pay closer attention to the primary grades because kids are coming up, I think we know the backside of this. Everybody knows. It's almost like you can hear the drumbeat in the distance for, well, we need more formalized assessments in the primary grades, and we need to start. I mean, we talked before about the lesson folks who run systems may have learned about mandates. What some folks may have taken from it might be very different from other folks. Like, a lot of what you've thought about is how the fact that it was such a large-scale mandate made it go wrong.
In some contexts.
But I think large-scale administrators may easily interpret it as, well, the mandates weren't strict enough. And I think a lot of principals and early childhood teachers certainly fear that what is in the not too distant minute and a half future are more formalized assessments in the primary grades. Like right now, we have a fair amount of latitude. We use our teachers' college assessments. It's part of what teachers do in their classroom. it does allow them to speak with so much more specificity about their kids' literacy learning. And I think it's had its impact on other things in classrooms. But I do think that people are fearful, understandably fearful, of what is down the road for early childhood when there are such high stakes. How are you going to get somebody to want to teach fourth grade and to do it with like spirit and curiosity and a sense of adventure for your kids?
It's short view. The thing that disturbs me systemically is that a lot of these reforms feel like they're taking the short view. We can get the numbers up a little this year by being stricter, but ultimately teachers aren't going to get smarter, and instruction is going to get more thoughtful.